biggest violations of medical ethics ever perpetrated on U.S. citizens. This week, medical experts and others are meeting to make sure something like this never happens again. And leading that effort is Amy Gutmann. She heads the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, and she is also the president of the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Gutmann, thanks for being with us. This is not a single incident. We've actually had many of these things happen. What is the purpose of your commission? Are we worried that these types of things are still happening today?
Ali, we can't know whether these things are happening today unless we have a fact-finding mission, and that's what President Obama has asked the Presidential Commission on Bioethics to do, to actually meet with experts and ask them, what is it today that would prevent these things from happening again? They've happened too many times in our history, and we want to make sure, and the president wants to make sure, that we can assure the American public that if they are part of a scientific experiment or a medical experiment, they will be treated with respect and fairly. So we don't know right now how the United States is relative to the rest of the world, and that's why the president has asked me to convene an international task force of experts. And those experts are going to sit down with me, and we're going to actually discuss how different countries and the United States fare in this regard. And we should come up with a report by year's end that can inform the public as well as the president of where we stand.
Okay, we know you're having more hearings in May. We'll follow this along with you. Very curious to see what happens. Dr. Amy Gutmann is the chair of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues and the president of the University of Pennsylvania.
To do is just very quickly go around and have the commission members just introduce themselves, and then I'm going to open it up to a few questions. Yes. Barbara, would you begin? Put your mic on.
Thanks. Barbara Atkinson from the University of Kansas Medical Center.
Nelson Michael from the Walter Army Institute of Research.
Christine Grady from the Department of Bioethics at the Clinical Center, NIH.
John Aris from a place you might know something about, University of Virginia.
Lonnie Ali.
Jim Wagner from Emory.
Raju Kushalapati, Harvard Medical School.
Nita Farahani from Vanderbilt University.
Steve Hauser, UC San Francisco.
Anita Allen, University of Pennsylvania.
Alex Garza, Department of Homeland Security.
And Dan Solmacy, the University of Chicago.
Certainly the problem of incidental findings, though, is an enormous, obvious overlap with the genetic situation. MRI scans often give things you didn't expect, and often they're things you don't know what to do with. UBOs, as they're called, unidentified bright objects. Do you want to have one of those in your brain? Well, you might, and what are you going to do with that? Very difficult to say. And then getting again into forensics, lie detection. Certainly there are those who believe this will become a more accurate means of assessing when somebody is practicing deception, and then other available methods. Personality prediction or profiling, again, something that might be used in making decisions about who gets access to which particular kinds of jobs or in the military, or also could be used in courts of law. Neuromarketing, a little scary concept there, trying to assess when people are responding effectively to certain kinds of advertising or branding, or even who's got the brain that's going to be most susceptible to a particular kind of manipulation.
So given the context of today's meeting, I pulled up an old slide, not that old, about a decade ago, at a cover of The Economist, The Future of Mind Control. And I thought that the headline of the article was an especially nice one to start with. It started with a quote, in case you can't read it. It says, "Genetics may yet threaten privacy, kill autonomy, make society homogeneous, and gut the concept of human nature." In other words, destroy Western civilization. But neuroscience could do all of these things first. So, yes, for us.
And sell more copies of The Economist.
Exactly. That's right. This next slide will show, when you actually look at it on the surface, when you blow up the brain, basically take the raisin and turn it back into the grape, there's our M, right on the back of the brain. So the point of this is that we have a direct way to visualize what you're seeing. And of course, because we know that the visual cortex activates when we imagine visual scenes, we know it activates when we're dreaming. It raises the possibility that we can actually see what others are thinking or dreaming. Finally, just one final technology, optical imaging. Light does get through your head the same way you can see light, red light through my finger here. Hopefully you don't see too much when I do this, but it's getting through, and we can use that as another way to image the brain. Where I think that's extremely important is in these little guys, subjects that won't sit still through MR scans, but will happily sit on mom's lap and play some games. So we will be able to do developmental neurobiology in a way we haven't before with these tools. And this was the issue of potentially remote sensing. We're not there yet with infrared technology, but conceivably could be.
By looking at the brain, we can read, we can understand states, mental states as well as mental traits, not just long-term personality, intelligence, whatever, but also current mood, intention, am I lying, do I want to buy this thing? That all comes from brain imaging. It's in principle available, and in practice available as well. And I am going to just say lie detection here now. It is it's in my opinion its validity has not been demonstrated. It has many potential uses, including national security, law, personnel screening, and so forth. There have been 2 attempts to use it in court. I was at the Daubert hearing in Memphis. It was much closer than I ever would have dreamed.
Issues will follow. Controversies will revolve around, the big controversies will revolve around abortion, will revolve around eugenics, and will revolve around disability rights and disabled communities. There will be hard questions about what kinds of tests one should allow. What do we do about people's consent? If we're really interested in getting all this sequence data and health data, electronic medical record data, useful, incredibly useful potential resource, do we have to ask everybody about each study we do? Do we have to ask them whether they want to be researched on at all? Do we say this is part of your duty as a good citizen, as a beneficiary of the healthcare system, to participate in this controlled work? What we are doing now, I think, is in some ways the worst of all worlds. We are using data broadly. When people don't understand that it is being used broadly, they give it for what they think is a narrow purpose, with a little bit of language tucked in at page 17 of the consent form saying, and maybe shared for other research or other medical purposes. And so people who participate in a Parkinson's disease and genetic study in Rhode Island find out, or they haven't found out yet, that their genotypes and phenotypes are in dbGaP, an NIH database which is accessible to researchers all over the world for research on anything they want to be researched on.
So we have the Human Genome Project. There's also the Human Brainome Project, and attempts to try to do as much neuroimaging as possible to try to see the commonalities across different individuals and also differences, and do a lot of the same types of population statistics that we've done on the genome side with the brainome side. Obviously, there's different information that the 2 fields can yield, but I wonder if you could speak to some of the ethical issues that you raised to see if you think that there are meaningful differences for data collection from neuroimaging than genetic collection.
I think there are differences. I'm not sure I think they are meaningful. I think everything I said with respect to, almost everything I said with respect to the questions of genetic data could be applied to neuroscientifically acquired data, also applies to old-fashioned health data. That these questions of incidental findings, of consent, of privacy, and of re-identification. I also think, though, getting back to the issue of forensic writ broad as encompassing not just courtroom use, and not even necessarily criminal or legal system use, but non-medical uses of both genetic technologies and neuroscience technologies. I think there There are similarities between some of the marketing issues, whether it's done based on someone's genome or based on somebody's MRI scan.
Bartha Knoppers was referenced earlier. She's been one of the people writing about this. Other countries are ahead of this, of us on this, and some beginning to recognize an actual right. I'm going past researcher duty to participant right to get this data back.
Points. One is just how incredibly fascinating and complicated the results of the new sciences of human behavior are, A, and B, how important it is to continue asking what those results do and do not mean for fundamental ideas like freedom and equality.
Neuroimaging and genetic information doesn't necessarily introduce new wrinkles, except in between those things, we might have things like the manner in which the information is collected, whether it's explicit or if it's covert, or the manner in which it's stored. So I know that Hank might speak to some of the re-identification issues that are currently happening and ways to make sure that the data is strongly protected, or consent to the use of the information and the extent to which people can consent in advance to the broad uses. So I wonder if there's something in between access and action that you might think would be an open ethical issue.
And the ability to influence or enhance brain function with these interventional techniques raises a host of deep philosophical questions that is beyond my charge today, and actually no one has really spoken about them, so I urge you to consider those. However, even the prospect of providing information about brain structure and function raises an interesting and challenging set of ethical questions. So like the Human Genome Project, neuroimaging makes available information about the present and future dispositions of persons, information that was unavailable prior to the development of these techniques. I'd like to suggest that information about the state of the brain has the potential to be even more sensitive and more personal than genetic information. Our brains, quite simply, are more closely linked to who we are psychologically than are our genes. If our genomes can be understood to delineate a space of possibilities for the way our lives might go, our brains may perhaps map out a space much more closely tied to actuality. In fact, our brains might be who we are. Brains are the repositories of all our memories, the proximal causes of our behaviors, including our mental states. Thus, information about the brain could potentially provide information about a person's past, present, and future behaviors, dispositions, and mental states. So today I'll touch briefly on the issues of mental privacy, lie detection, prediction, the ethics of consciousness, freedom and responsibility, and public understanding of science. So to begin, let's consider mental privacy. Each of us is accustomed to his thoughts being accessible only to himself. And with neuroimaging, however, the privacy of our innermost thoughts is at least potentially threatened. The risk is far from immediate, but the recent advances made by novel techniques in discerning mental content from brain scans are impressive. So, for example, imagine legal situations where self-incrimination is a possibility. Are there instances in which brain scans could be compelled or should be prohibited? With respect to the law, should scans that reveal the content of mental states be treated more like physical evidence or like testimony? A number of interesting and potentially important questions bear upon how evidence from neuroimaging squares with, for example, Fifth Amendment rights. More immediately, there are already substantial efforts to use neuroimaging for lie or truth detection in ways that don't require the identification of mental content. So various methods have been devised in general by measuring correlates of familiarity or arousal. Although some reports have claimed accuracies of up to 90%, when care is taken to look at the rates of false positive and negatives and to take into account base rates, such tests are clearly far from reliable enough to use in the courts. Furthermore, careful consideration of the research reveals serious shortcomings in the experiments by which these technologies are developed and tested. And so far, I think these fail to establish external and ecological validity. But despite these caveats, there's clear and continuing incentive to develop neuroimaging techniques to distinguish truth from lies for the use in the courtroom, or perhaps more worryingly, for use in interrogation. Mounting pressures to detect terrorist plots suggest that we'll continue to see efforts to improve such techniques and to apply them. Serious thought should be given to the conditions under which it could be ethical to use such techniques. I fear that setting too low a bar may set us on a slippery slope where brain data will be taken to be more admissible than they should be and far more dispositive than they in fact are. There are indications that neuroimaging may be useful in predicting future aggression, criminal recidivism, or mental illness. And when I say predict here, I mean that in a probabilistic sense. How should such probabilistic information be understood, and how and under what circumstances is it morally permissible or even obligatory to use it? What levels of probability warrant action or treatment? More fundamentally, there are difficulties in realistically assessing the predictive power of our techniques. Recall that neuroimaging shows correlations and not causation. Suppose, for example, that we find that certain patterns of brain activity are correlated with the disposition to behave violently. Adequate assessment of the predictive power of our data requires knowledge of the prevalence of these activity patterns and behaviors in the general population.
My question goes back to Dr. Rosen from session 2 this morning. He mentioned that we are still a few years away from covert brain imaging. But in 2009, early 2009, CNN reported that they were using remote neuromonitoring in the war on terror. Perhaps you can explain the difference, and is it possible that the Defense Department has moved past the medical community for neuroimaging capabilities? Thank you.
What I believe is that law enforcement and the military have weapons that
That's
can
not Hank. Okay, I'm sorry.
remotely influence people. If you were going to make guidelines that a brain image is what's going to determine whether they're guilty or innocent, they can be attacked even remotely. There are weapons. One is called Medusa. It's a microwave attack. It gives a microwave auditory effect. They could hear threats, violence. If you read their brain, they would appear to be delusional. They might become antisocial. But the truth would be they're under an influence. Just by taking a reading of their brain, I don't think it's something that can actually determine their state. There's a cause for their state. Unless that's understood, I don't think this will work. I'd like to ask your opinion about it.
Ask you to and identify yourself and ask your question.
My name is Miriam Snyder. I believe that this commission was launched because of some of the horrific medical experiments that have been done. Is that why the president initiated this?
No, we were launched actually well before those revelations came, and we will talk about that charge by the president tomorrow.
Right, but we have a history. We have a problem. There are people being killed behind human experimentation that is unregulated, unsupervised, and above all, the research shows that injections are being used to induce many of these diseases under the study of neuroimaging. What's going to be done to stop this? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Gerald Schatz, and I'm a lawyer and retired assistant professor of ethics and law at Michigan State University. There is law out there. The bioethics community has been oblivious to it, but there is international law. There is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the United States ratified in 1992, and it makes informed consent an absolute requirement, no exceptions, not even in emergencies, subject to those normal legal fictions of consenting for the incapacitated patient to medical care and so forth. Additionally, the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions make research very, very difficult or prohibited altogether for those individuals who are caught up in war and armed conflicts. Thank you.